Here's how I would do a teleological argument essay, so a design argument essay. This video is going to members of my Patreon way earlier than it will go to the YouTube channel. This is especially relevant perhaps to class of 2025, sitting there A-level philosophy in 2025. Paper 2 hasn't come out yet, but this is the most likely essay topic for Metaphysics of God in Paper 2. Doesn't mean it will be this one, but I'm making this for then because it could be this one. It may come up, it may not have come up in 2025 if you're watching this afterwards though, so it might be useful for future years too. Anyway, I'm going to take the title as, does the teleological argument show that God exists? Of course, it wouldn't necessarily be phrased exactly like that. They might say design argument, although that's a bit cheeky because it says teleological on the specification, I think. Or it could say something like, do the teleological arguments show that God exists? Or prove or persuasively convince, are they convincing, are they persuasive, this sort of thing. So, but it's all the same question, right? Because the teleological argument stands for the different versions of it. And they're all just saying, does it work? But as ever, make sure you use the exact phrasing of the question. Golden rule for all exams, but especially philosophy essays, make sure you answer the question in the exact terms set using the words in it and defining them if you need to. So here's how I would do this essay. First of all, I'm going to upfront say no, they don't show that God exists. I actually go backwards and forwards. I'm forever changing my mind about the teleological argument for the existence of God. It's the one philosophical argument, except perhaps religious experience, but that's not on the specification. It's the one argument on the specification that I think can sometimes actually be persuasive. I believe in God, but for other reasons. But however, in this case, for this particular example essay plan, which I'm showing you in the hope that it would inspire ideas and help you with structuring and content for yourselves, I'm going to go for no. But I'm going to do a qualified no and say no, they don't. Putting this up front as per my way of doing philosophy essays, state your view, your one sentence answer in a sentence to the question right at the start so the examiner knows what you're going to argue. But I'm going to say, but the fine-tuning argument in particular does offer a way of looking at the universe that can give rise to a very powerful intuition that it was designed. I suppose you might say, is that not the same thing as saying that it does show that God exists? Well, perhaps, but actually I'm going to say, for this essay plan, no, it doesn't show God exists, but it could give you a very strong feeling of maybe the universe is designed, even if that doesn't work as conclusive or rationally weighty evidence. Yeah, so slightly nuanced. Might be easy just to say no, or in fact yes if you want to argue yes. Don't freak out that I'm using the fine-tuning argument up front. Of course, I'm going to look at the other two arguments that are currently on the A-level philosophy AQA specification, teleological ones, and have been since 2017. No sign of that changing anytime soon, by the way, although it will change eventually. So there's three teleological arguments on the philosophy specification. This is an extra one from sort of extra extension, what you might call, yeah, extension reading. You don't have to use it. I'm going to use it in this essay plan. You can do a really good essay without using it, but I think it's a really important teleological essay plan argument, and it's one that I've shared with my students and that I teach them about. So I'm going to use it, and I'll give you pointers for how you can learn more about it if you want. So anyway, that's going to be my one sentence thesis. Now, rather than just explaining all the teleological arguments up front for this kind of essay, and I think this works particularly well for cosmological argument essays as well, I'm gonna, instead of doing an intro explaining them all, I'm gonna give a teleological argument now up front, after the one sentence introduction or thesis statement at the start. So I'm gonna give the human Paley argument, which is effectively the same argument. Paley uses the analogy of a watch, which is the unique bit to him, but it's complex machines in Hume, right? They're very similar. In my view, it's effectively the same argument. It's a teleological argument from spatial order. The world is complex and ordered and seems, or at least parts of it, seem as though they have been, exhibit complexity and order towards a purpose. This is shared by objects which are designed. So by analogy, we can argue that the world must have been designed. I know there's other ways of interpreting Paley as making a deductive argument and so on, but yeah, for simplicity's sake, in this essay, I'm going to sort of categorize these two arguments together as a spatial argument, a spatial teleological argument. Sorry, all over the place today. A teleological argument from spatial order based on analogy. So I would trot those out, not in massive detail, but summarize them, and then go into analyzing those. And of course, there's tons of criticisms of those that you've probably learned about and are in textbooks and things. Now, the thing is, you could do an essay just walking through those criticisms and lots of those criticisms, but there's more to get to and there's more to say. So I'm actually here going to mention them quite briefly in passing. So these are Hume's criticisms of the teleological argument, and say things like, there are many reasons to not consider these arguments strong, because arguments from analogy are weak. The analogy is not that strong in the first place. Hume says, well, you might as well compare the universe to something else, like a vegetable or organic matter. It wouldn't necessarily lead to the classical theist God. Hume has lots of things to say about that, doesn't he? But then I'm sort of sweeping past all of those. I might mention these like in the same sentence, very briefly gesture towards them. But then I'm going to say that actually a decisive reason that the spatial teleological arguments fail is because of the theory of evolution. Because in my view, this is what basically demolishes the classic form of the teleological argument. When the theory of evolution turns up in the 19th century, now we have a very good or powerful explanation for where the natural order and appearance of design in the world comes from. There's an alternative explanation, which is that it's evolved by natural selection and evolution. So that's a reason not to be persuaded by these arguments, because we don't need God, as these arguments claim, to explain things like the way that the eye is formed towards a purpose, or organs in the human body, or whatever it is, all the typical examples from classrooms, a camel's hump and how it stores water, all those different things, even plants or plant order. Yeah, we now can see that it may have evolved, and that's the most popular scientific theory now. So you don't need a divinity to explain how it happened. So then I'm going to move on to, because actually I don't think there are any strong replies to that. I mean, you could come back and say, well, there are arguments out there from creationists and so on about how the eye couldn't have evolved because there's too much of a leap from different stages. How do you get from like one photosensitive cell to a fully working retina and so on? You could get into that, but I'm not going to, because I'm going to save space for saying other things. So I'm going to say, actually, I think there's no decisive rebuttal to that in philosophical terms. And then that means I've got room to now move on to Swinburne's argument. So Swinburne's argument is on the specification as well, isn't it? This is an argument from temporal order. In fact, the language of spatial and temporal, that comes from Swinburne. If you're not sure about that, go and find my revision video on metaphysics of God, which is out there somewhere. And I'm going to summarize this. So this is, remember, it's along the lines of, there is some temporal order which we can't explain and some which we can explain. The stuff that we can explain, like songs, dances, timetables, these sort of things, is the result of design, of a free rational choice. Therefore, by analogy, we could argue that the temporal order we can't explain, namely the laws of nature, the fact that things happen in a regular and predictable way most of the time in nature and the world, which is a type of temporal order as well, regularities of succession. By analogy, that must have been designed by a free rational agent, by free rational choice. That's the argument, and I think this is actually very elegant and appealing. It's an attractive and interesting argument. Certain ways of looking at it, it clicks for me and it works, but ultimately on further investigation I'm going to argue I think this fails as well. And most philosophers would agree, not all by any means, but the majority for whatever reason. Why? Well, another criticism which wasn't mentioned in the previous analytic paragraph, which I suppose could be, though, if you wanted to rework this and have a through line going through the whole essay, a golden thread of a criticism, it would be what's associated with Hume as the argument from a unique case criticism, which is that we are arguing here about a unique entity, namely the universe, and we have no other examples of universes to compare with this one. So it's a big leap to make a kind of conclusion about where it came from or what's behind it when we don't have other universes to check this against. So there are no other instances of universes being designed or not designed that we can compare with. We only have this one. So it's an argument from unique case, so it's not strong. And the same applies to Swinburne's argument, because we have no other sets of laws of nature to compare this set of laws of nature to. So we don't know if laws of nature are the kinds of thing that can be designed or not. And he's saying, oh no, yeah, but look, you can make this analogy of temporal order. But there I would argue back and say, well, is actually the analogy between human-made temporal order and the laws of nature themselves that strong? What do they share in common? Well, these are both things that happen they're both to do with time. They're both to do with temporal order and order in time, but tons of things are to do with time. Everything that happens in time. Therefore, it's a weak analogy. Another way of saying this, look, the human temporal order is possible because the laws of nature are as they are. But then to jump to talking about the laws of nature themselves is a completely different type of thing, a completely different category. So they're not similar enough to make a good analogy. And because we have no other sets of laws of nature to compare with, therefore this argument doesn't work. There's not enough of a basis to make the induction that the laws of nature must have been designed. So then, this would now leave me time to bring up the fine-tuning argument. And yeah, if you've still got time, if you're looking at this way ahead of exams and you've got time to look into this, then you haven't learned about it yet, I would strongly encourage you to look into the fine-tuning argument presented by people like F.R. Tennant and William Lane Craig has a version. I think he's actually presenting someone else's version, but that's one of the best ways to get into it, is to look up Craig's YouTube video. In fact, I think videos plural about the fine-tuning argument. Go and check those out. What is this argument? This is the argument that there are certain properties in the universe, including constants is one of them. What are constants? They're mathematical values that apply to aspects of nature, like the strength of gravity, so the gravitational constant, the strength of the strong nuclear force that holds subatomic particles together in atomic nuclei. Those are constants, those are numbers which are incredibly, the argument is that if those were different, those values and others that are out there, I haven't listed them here, but you could go and find out about them when you look at the presentations of this argument. If those numbers were different by just a tiny fraction, things like 1 part in 10 to the 123rd power or something like that. So, if they were 0.0, hundreds or thousands of zeros, 1 different, then the universe would be completely different, and it wouldn't have been able to form in the way that it has now. It would have there are some of these numbers where if they're slightly different, then the universe would have just expanded indefinitely, or it would have collapsed in on itself, and you wouldn't have been able to have our universe, and you wouldn't have been able to have our kind of life. So the argument is, this indicates that the universe, these aspects of the universe have been finely tuned to allow for our universe to come about and our kind of life, which indicates that these properties were designed by an all-powerful universe creating intelligence. And again, I think this is a really exciting argument. To me, it's actually quite intuitively appealing. Well, again, I can look at it in a certain way and it clicks. However, today, at least, on further investigation and inspection, there is still it still ultimately fails. Again, I would say because of the unique case criticism, because we have no other universes this time. It was laws of nature before, and if you were doing this for spatial arguments, it would be, again, no other universes. We have no other universes to compare this one to. So even though we can imagine how the universe might be different, which can lead it to it seeming astonishing that it is the way that it is, we still can't say anything intelligent about the probability of this universe turning out a certain way, because we don't know how often universes turn out like this. We don't know how likely it is for a universe with all these properties to occur, because we only have one universe. So we don't know if there's a universe lottery out there, we've just got super lucky, or not, because all we've got is this existence. We don't know the chances of certain universes appearing. I mean, some scientists go a different route in responding to this and say, well, actually, the real explanation of this is that there's a multiverse and there are all sorts of universes out there. And because there are many, if potentially infinite or just a huge number of universes, eventually you're going to get the universe which has the conditions for life. I don't think that's a very powerful response, though, because, I mean, in terms of, say in terms of Occam's razor, you don't have to agree with Occam's razor, but it's quite a well-regarded inductive principle. You are massively multiplying entities there. It's much simpler to say there's an intelligent designer than there are there's a near infinity of universes going on, which means we get R1 eventually. But I don't even think you need to resort to a multiverse ultimately, because the point still is we're just imagining the universe being different, but we don't know anything about the conditions under which, again, constants, laws of nature are brought about. So we don't know what the probability of this set occurring is. So we just run up against the brute fact mystery, a bit like the cosmological argument, that this universe is here, but we're not left able to say anything intelligent about what the chances of this universe being here are. So I would argue, today at least, ultimately the fine-tuning argument, it gives you a particular way of looking at the universe where we can imagine it could have been different, and it seems astonishing that it's this way, but we're still left with the straightforward mystery that there is a universe at all, which is in a strict philosophical sense unexplainable. So the teleological argument remains unsatisfying. So that's how I would do a teleological argument essay. Like I say, if you haven't looked at the fine-tuning argument and don't have time or don't want to, you could expand earlier parts of this essay, like maybe go into more details about the criticisms of Hume and Paley's argument. Remembering, by the way, that Hume is criticizing, well, both of them do this. Hume raises the teleological argument in order to disagree with it, because he's not convinced by it. Paley raises it and discusses it in order to agree with it, because he is convinced by it. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that Hume is convinced by the teleological argument he raises and that you've had to learn about. But yeah, you could say more about those and expand that. However, I like this way of doing the essay because there's a kind of progression, and you can kind of go argument by argument, and the fine-tuning argument is where it gets really interesting for me. But yeah, I hope that's been helpful to you, and there's been some revision of content in there, and it sparks ideas, gives you inspiration for things you can incorporate to your own essay plans. Any questions, problems, clarifications, please comment on Patreon, or if this ever goes up on YouTube, please comment question on there. And yeah, all the best.